Can you envisage any spending cuts that this government could get past its backbenchers at the moment?
Someone's going to have to come up at some point and say, if we're really going to pay for all of this, then you, the electorate, that's you on 40 or 50 or 70,000 pounds, you're going to have to pay for that, rather than pretending that it can all be paid for by these people with 10 million pounds or these non-doms or people on over 100,000 pounds or whatever it is.
Monzo Business is the proud partner of The Rest is Money. Now, did you know that over 600,000 businesses are already banking with Monzo Business? And mine is one of them. To celebrate us teaming up, we've got a special offer for you. New customers get Monzo Business Pro or Team for free for the first 6 months. Just head to monzo.com/therestismoney to claim it for your business. Now, maybe you run your own company and you're looking for a bank with the solutions to make your financial admin easier, like expense cards that help your team save loads of time as your business grows. Just go to monzo.com/therestismoney to learn more about the special offer and find out which of their plans is right for you. Offer is available to new Monzo Business customers only for either Pro or Team plan. Offer ends on the 31st of July 2025. After the offer period ends, Pro will be £9 a month and Team from £25 a month. Expense cards are only available with Team. Only sole traders or limited company directors in the UK can apply. T's and C's apply. Hello and welcome to The Rest is Money with me, Steph McGovern.
And with me, Robert Paston. Today, we are delighted to have a regular on this programme, Paul Johnson, who is head of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And it's a big and emotional moment because we are recording on his very last day in the job, essentially as de facto policeman of the nation's finances and whether chancellors are behaving responsibly. And he's been doing this job since 2011.
Yeah, and what a time we've had in that 14 years that he's been in charge of the IFS, as you say, keeping an eye on everything that the government's been telling us and deciding fiscally in that time. So because we've got so much to talk to him about, we're going to split this in two, aren't we? So today we're going to focus on what's happening right now. There's been some really interesting research that's come out from this annual report from another acronym, the OBR, Office for Budget Responsibility. So we want to talk to him a bit about that and where we're at. And then in a second episode, we're going to go back through his career and just look at, what it was like when he came in that Cameron Osborne years in 2011 to take over and, where we've gone through in that time and what he'd do if he was Chancellor as well. But we're going to start, first of all, looking at the now. So here's our interview with Paul Johnson.
So, Paul, we've just had the annual assessment by the Office for Budget Responsibilities of the strength, or in this case, we should say weakness, of the UK's public finances. I suppose the question where I wanted to start was, obviously, there's a lot of focus at the moment on the importance of the so-called fiscal rules. These are these rules which are supposed to limit how much the government borrows to pay for day-to-day spending and how much our national debt rises. Now, we've had these sorts of fiscal rules now for well over 25 years. And yet, over that time, debt and deficit has been rising at an extraordinary rate. Reconcile these two phenomena, as it were. On the one hand, we've got governments saying managing debt and deficit really matters and we've got strict rules. And on the other hand, they've just not worked at all in limiting borrowing and the rise in debt. What's going on?
Yeah, good question. And that OBR document in somewhat civil service-ish tones is really quite concerning. I mean, it refers to our fiscal situation as, quotes, relatively concerning, and shows how our debt, our deficit have risen much faster than nearly all other countries over the last 25 years, and how actually we're paying more interest, a higher rate of interest on our debt than any country in the OECD other than Iceland and New Zealand. So this is quite concerning stuff. So how have we got there? Well, I think partly it's because our fiscal rules have always been forward-looking, in the sense that they're aiming at something in 5 years' time, and literally 5 years' time never arrives in the sense of the fiscal rules, because it's always if we do this, that, and the other, where would we be in 5 years' time? It's partly, of course, because we have had a number of extraordinary shocks over this period. I mean, the financial crisis being still much the biggest and much the longest lasting of them. And then when we've had those shocks, we've kind of, chucked everything away and started again in terms of fiscal rules. We did the same around Brexit. Obviously, we've had the big issue around COVID. And I think to some extent, governments have somewhat gamed these rules in the sense of saying, well, look, if we commit to these really big spending cuts over the next period of time, then we'll get to a good position fiscally. It is worth saying we did on one occasion meet just the aim of borrowing only for investment, which broadly speaking is what all of the governments over this time have done.
When was that?
Only once since 2010. That was in 2019. So just before COVID, we actually got there. And then, of course, COVID struck.
But when you say about the financial shocks and things, everyone's had them. So why are we the worst?
Giving you the starkest counterexample, Germany's national debt has not risen since the financial crisis, or at least not significantly, and they are in a way stronger fiscal position. Now, they've got other problems, industrial problems of a very significant sort. But why is it that Germany has been able to limit the rise in its national debt in a way that we just haven't?
Well, I think there are several answers to that. One is that they've got much stronger constitutional rules about what they're able to do in terms of borrowing. They were hit much less hard by the financial crisis than we were. I mean, our financial sector is much more important to our economy than it is there. They started off in a better position as well. And you're right, they're now in a much stronger position, both in terms of the level of their debt and broadly speaking, the interest rate they're paying on is about a full 2 percentage points less than we are. If we have,
and so they're going on a massive spending splurge to regenerate their economy in a way that we just can't afford to do.
Well, exactly. If we were paying the same interest rate on our debt as they are, we'd be about 50 billion quid a year better off. I mean, it's that scale of magnitude of difference that we're seeing. And you're exactly right. They now have the financial firepower to do far more than we possibly could at the moment. And one of the worries that we face is, given where we are now, if we had another crisis, how much firepower would we have to deal with it?
One of the many warnings that the OBR makes is we do not have the financial cushion to absorb another shock without incredibly serious damage to the public finances. And as all of us know, there will be another shock. The notion that we live in a world where there aren't financial crises is absurd.
Absolutely. I mean, they seem to be coming along more frequently as we go through. And I think it's one of the reasons why it's so important for governments when we are in non-crisis times. And whilst today doesn't feel very easy, we are in a sort of non-crisis time. It's so important to really get these fiscal numbers, get the borrowing and so on under control. And as the OBR have shown, broadly speaking, we have failed to do that.
There are sort of two issues, though, aren't there? Or rather, two time horizons. There are the short-term horizons where the deficit and debt is pushed up because either we have a shock like COVID, where government spending went through the roof, or the financial crisis, where government spending and borrowing goes through the roof. Or politicians make short-term profits about fixing our schools, fixing our hospitals, all perfectly reasonable promises to make to the electorate. We all want decent schools and hospitals. And those two will inevitably constantly put ratchet up, as it were, the national debt. But then there's another issue, and this is one of those things that the OBR has historically focused on to almost zero effect when it comes to influencing politicians, which is there are these massive long-term liabilities, whether it is the cost of an aging population, which means that costs for the health service are rising exponentially, whether it is the cost of paying. I mean, one of the things that this report says is that the cost to the public purse of the so-called triple lock, that is guaranteeing to pensioners that the state pension will go up by a minimum of inflation earnings or 2.5%. They say that will cost, is it 15.5 billion? But it's 3 times over the next few years what it was originally forecast to cost. And then if you go decades out, the cost of maintaining living standards for older people relative to a shrinking workforce get even bigger. And politicians are incredibly bad at tackling these long-term liabilities.
Well, I think that's why we need to take, again, responsibility with the fiscal numbers really seriously, because we focus every budget, every year, is the Chancellor going to meet her fiscal rules or whatever over the next 4 or 5 years? And you always get these calls from people saying, well, actually, it doesn't matter so much. Maybe we should loosen them. But everything gets harder, I'm afraid, as we go further through the next couple or 3 or 4 decades. It's not only the ageing population, which you've referred to, and that will mean more money on pensions and health and so on. The Prime Minister, just a month or so ago, promise another nearly £40 billion a year on defence. Now, that's completely unfunded. It may not happen. I mean, a lot of these international promises never actually amount to anything, but he's on the record as saying we will spend another 35 or 40 billion pounds a year on defence by the mid-2030s. Add that to the cost of health, add that to the cost of pensions, add that to the cost of climate change policies and so on. And we are looking at another really big increase in tax, presumably over this period, to pay for all of this, following what is, through the 2020s. The 2020s has been an astonishing decade, or will be an astonishing decade, because we will have seen a huge increase in the size of the state, a huge increase in tax over this period, whilst we've still got a really big borrowing problem, but completely different from anything we've seen in the previous 50 years. And it's really hard to see how that doesn't carry on into the 2030s and beyond.
So, I mean, you mentioned there about the defence spending, and you're saying, that's unfunded, it might never happen. But then there are businesses that are changing their decisions based on that. I was at Harland and Wolff in Northern Ireland a couple of weeks ago, where, they've got this £1.6 billion contract to build these 3 ships over the next decade or so. These, the ships that are going to support the Royal Navy and things. And this company's making huge decisions off the back of what is being told is going to be spent in the industry. They're having to spend a fortune on training people up, getting the right skills, completely changing this old, this business Harland and Wolff has been going for a lot, over 100 years. It's where they built the Titanic, and, but they haven't built ships there since like 2002 or something. So they're having to completely modify everything and invest loads of money to do that. And isn't there a danger, when you're saying something like this money might never come? And I'm not talking about that specific contract, but that money around defence. But how, as a business, are you meant to make any decisions if it feels so fickle, I guess, and it might never happen?
The initial increase in spending on defence is happening. I mean, that's in the numbers, and it is all going on building stuff. If you look at the numbers over this Parliament, the additional defence spending, it's not going to pay for one more soldier or sailor. It's all going on equipment. Now, I've no idea whether that's the right thing to do, but that's the decision that's been made, and that is baked in. But the change that the Prime Minister has promised by the mid-2030s, by 2035, is on a different scale from the increase that we're seeing over this Parliament. So over this Parliament, we're seeing an increase of, 0.2% of national income or something. And then he's wanting to sort of triple or quadruple the scale of that over the first 5 years of the 2030s. Now, that's the commitment that was made at the international summit. That would be a huge problem for the public finances, because that's a really big increase in defence spending. That would mean, presumably, huge amounts of contracts for all of these defence industries. But, if I was Harland and Wolff, I wouldn't be sort of at the moment banking on that bit of the increase happening. We've seen so many of these international agreements go by the wayside. I was in the Treasury. This is a different issue, but I think it's kind of telling. I was in the Treasury in the 2000s when there was this big conference at Gleneagles where Gordon Brown helped push through this commitment from all of these nations that we get overseas aid to 0.7% of national income. Now, the UK was one of very few countries that actually did that, despite everyone signing up to it. And now we've completely reneged on it. And no one kind of remembers those international commitments when other priorities arise.
That's a sort of important and fascinating issue in its own, which we're definitely going to come back to. I also, though, wanted to talk about the vice that the current government is currently in. So we recently saw that Labour Party rebellion, backbench Labour MPs rebelling against the welfare cuts, which were supposed to yield, I don't know, 5.5 billion and are now yielding a big fat zero, because in the end, the government did not have the numbers, despite having this stonking majority, to push through changes to eligibility for disability benefits. Now, the markets have taken the view that this means that this is a government that is incapable now of serious welfare reform, or indeed any kind of cut that would disadvantage those on lower incomes or vulnerable people. And therefore the markets have just taken the view that the only lever that the government has to pull is tax. And, investors are not even confident that they'll be able to raise tax enough. So, as I say, there are quite a lot of lenders to the UK who are just concerned that this issue of an unsustainable deficit and rising debt is not one that the UK will be able to manage. I suppose the questions here are, what is your view? I mean, I've got no doubt in my mind that Rachel Reeves is absolutely committed as Chancellor to honouring her own fiscal rules. Can you envisage any spending cuts that this government could get past its backbenchers at the moment? Is it inevitable that in the autumn and probably subsequently that taxes will continue to rise, even though the overall take of taxation from the UK economy, the tax burden is, I think, at levels we haven't seen since, is it the 50s?
Well, effectively ever, in a consistent way. Usually governments have three levers. If they've got a problem with public finances, they can cut spending, they can increase borrowing, or they can increase taxes. Well, we certainly can't increase borrowing. I mean, not just because we're up against this government's particular fiscal rules, but again, as the Office of Budget Responsibility pointed out this week, these fiscal rules are about as loose a set of fiscal rules as it's possible to imagine. It's just that we're in such a bad position that even though they're very loose, we're barely meeting them. And we saw what happened last week when it looked like Rachel Reeves might be, her position might not be completely secure. The market's worried about changes to borrowing. An interest rate on our debt just zoomed up, very, very fast before it came back down again.
And that's because investors took the view that whoever replaced her would be,
the only reason for replacing her would be to have a looser fiscal policy. So I genuinely don't think there's space for more borrowing, and not just because of the very specifics of the fiscal rules, but because there just isn't more space for more borrowing. Spending, the sort of public service spending numbers were set in the spending review about a month or so ago, and all experience tells you that what happens to numbers set in spending reviews is they never go down. They quite often go up later on. But, the government, so the Chancellor's not going to reopen negotiations with Yvette Cooper or Bridget Phillipson or something and say, actually, sorry, you're getting 5% less. On welfare, if you can't do anything to disability benefits, where we've seen a literal doubling in the number of people claiming these things, coming forward and claiming each month and being awarded them, and a vast increase in spending. If you can't do anything with those, then you might as well give up and go home in terms of welfare reform. So that really does leave only taxes as the only thing, the only space for adjustment. Now, we don't know how much that adjustment might need to be in the autumn. I've seen all sorts of numbers floating around. The answer is we just don't know. This is very dependent on but
it's probably tens of billions of pounds. It's not going to be a few billions of pounds.
It probably is. We don't know. It probably is. You're right. Tens of billions. But again, it makes a big difference. If it's 10 or 20 billion, then that's the sort of amount that the Chancellor will be able to find by some more freezes in income tax allowances and so on, and some other sort of relatively small, maybe not politically too damaging changes. If, as is quite plausible, it's more like 40 billion.
Well, the National Institute said almost 60 billion recently.
Well, as I say, I think these numbers are incredibly speculative, but it is possible it would be that scale. If it's in anything remotely that scale, I genuinely don't see how you do that without basically breaking some of their commitments on income tax, national insurance or VAT, because you just can't raise that scale of money without using those taxes.
So, I mean, the Chancellor's in this, it feels like this impossible situation, because if she loosens the fiscal rules or breaks them, then the markets will put up our borrowing costs and make it a lot more expensive for us to borrow money as a country and, push up debt and everything else. If she doesn't loosen the rules or break them and instead makes these major cuts, the backbenchers vote against it if they're not happy with them, and therefore it's impossible to get them through. And as you say, their manifesto was to not tax working people. But again, that feels like a rule which inevitably sticking to it is by proxy going to put up all of our taxes anyway, make life harder for us, because the cost of living will feel a lot more expensive, because there'll be lots of indirect ways that working people will be paying more. So do you think this is an impossible situation?
And can I just add to that, Steph, if you don't mind, the sort of elephant in the room here, which is this is an economy that has not grown for 15, 16 years. This is an economy in which living standards have not risen to any significant degree for 15, 16 years. Obviously, the great cliche is the way to solve our problems is to get productivity up and growth up, which if those two things happened, you would actually just automatically get more tax revenues, because there'd be more transactions, and on those transactions, and there'd be more income, and on the income on the transactions, there would be more of a tax yield, right? But the problem with these fiscal rules is that they massively limit the ability for any government to stimulate the economy. So how do you reconcile? Because the government's position, Reeves's position, is there can be no sustainable growth if we don't meet our fiscal rules. But the history of the last 16 years is obsession with fiscal rules has delivered zero growth. So how do you reconcile getting the growth up with honouring the fiscal ruals?
Okay, I agreed with you until the end there, where I really disagree with you quite fundamentally.
Well, I think I'm raising a question rather than expressing a point of view. And we can come back to my own view on this, but just tell me what you think.
So you're obviously, you're right. What is the fundamental reason we're in this terribly difficult position at the moment? It is, as you say, that we've had very little growth over a very long period of time. Now, that makes the politics of everything really hard, because everything becomes a zero-sum game. So if you're going to increase taxes and increase spending, you're making some people worse off in absolute terms, because their incomes aren't growing. Actually, what the last government especially did was, where have we got that extra revenue from? We've got it from companies. We're getting far more from corporation tax than we've ever had before, astonishingly. Not something I would ever have projected. And they're getting it from people on very high incomes. And we're getting far more tax from people on very high incomes than ever before. And over this period,
it's a tiny proportion of people who are paying the most tax, isn't it? We've talked about this on the podcast before.
Absolutely.
It's such a tiny number.
The top 1% of income taxpayers are paying about 30% of income tax. And that's up from about 25 or 26% in 2010. And not because their incomes have grown more than other people's, but because the tax system has got much more heavily sort of weighted towards that group of people. So it makes it then harder to say, if you're going to get more tax, where are we going to get it from? Is it really going to be companies and high income people again? I think that becomes more and more difficult over time. So going to Steph's question about where does that mean, if we're going to raise taxes, that's going to inevitably mean a break in the manifesto rules? Well, first thing I'd say is it's absolutely obvious to me the manifesto was broken in the first budget. The manifesto says very clearly, we will not raise rates of national insurance contributions. It does not say we will not raise rates of employee national insurance contributions. It says we will not raise rates of national insurance contributions. In a sense, that pass has already gone.
Although Labour, extraordinarily, this government refuses to accept that.
Oh, absolutely. I know that. They probably get away with that because you don't actually see it in your pay packet directly. But if they really do keep to, we're not going to increase employee national insurance, we're not going to increase any rates of income tax, then they're going to have to
VAT.
Or VAT. Then you're going to have to do horrible things like really mess around with pension taxation or something, because if you're looking for where can you get serious money, that's where you get serious. That's where you could potentially get serious money. I'm not saying it's a good idea. I think it'd be a terrible idea. But I think, that is somewhere where you could look. Now, the role of the fiscal rules in all all of this, I absolutely don't think that they are constraining our capacity to grow or manage the economy, and that this government is investing, in terms of government investment, really big amounts of money, both certainly relative to history and relative to the last government's plans. Although, again, some kudos to the last government. They also increased investment spending quite significantly. Now,
no, but I would slightly challenge you on that, because it comes back to my political point earlier. It seems to me that if you had an infrastructure plan that was overwhelmingly weighted towards what are the investments we need to make,
which we don't have. I agree with that.
To get the growth rate up,
yeah.
Then I would agree with you. But actually, what you've got is an infrastructure plan that is much more about what they think are voters' priorities. Fixing schools and hospitals.
So that's not a problem with the fiscal rules. That's a problem.
That's a problem with the implementation,
with the priorities. And they talk a lot about big increases in investment spending, but actually we don't have any increase in investment on transport, for example, which is really crucial to growth, and a big increase in defence investment spending, which is a different set of objectives that we have. And the issue, of course, with all of this investment spending, and the issue with, I think it's good that they're doing it, is it's all long term. So, the impact on the economy is for the long run. So that's why it's always difficult to prioritise in the short run. And I think it's to the credit of previous chancellors and this one that they are prioritising the long run, despite the fact that they would almost certainly get more bang for their political buck if they were to be spending actually even more of it on schools and teachers and so on.
So it's not the rules that are the problem, or having these rules, it's the way they're being used. This is basically not being managed well.
It's that there's not a relentless enough focus on those measures which would generate growth within this within these fiscal parameters.
Yeah, and look, we've had a long period of very poor growth. We've had a period since 2016 of absolute political stasis and chaos, which you can't undo all of that in the first year of a government, and you're going to struggle to undo much of it over a whole parliamentary term. So we also have to think very carefully about what are reasonable expectations of governments. But again, going back to your point, Robert, about the lack of growth after such a long period of lack of growth. And actually, remember back to 2010 and 2015, an electorate at that point, which was willing to vote for quite big spending cuts. I mean, they were made very clear in the 2010 Conservative manifesto, and even clearer, amazingly, in the 2015 Conservative manifesto. We're going to keep punching you. We are going to keep cutting. We're going to cut welfare. And that got voted for. But after 15 years of lack of growth, and an election campaign last year where everyone was saying, it's fine, we're not going to cut anything or increase taxes. I think the electorate is understandably pretty cynical about a lot of this.
And they're also spending a lot of time now trying to guess what might happen in this autumn budget. Because I know, like me as a business owner, we took that hit from last year's budget with the increase in national insurance contributions, with the change in the business rate relief, with minimum wage going up, and the stuff around the employment bill. And now it's a case of trying to guess what's going to come out in autumn, which is, I think Robert said this on the show, that uncertainty is just really crippling. And so what do you think is going to happen? There's talk of, we've had Neil Kinnock going on about this wealth tax, this 2% on assets over £10 million. We've heard about possibly income tax thresholds, the freezing of them continuing past 2028, which will obviously push, and as your organisation said, a lot more people into those brackets, and that'll raise more money, but inevitably be a tax on working people, a tax increase. So what do you think is going to happen?
I mean, your point about the uncertainty all this creates is really important. I mean, it clearly creates uncertainty for businesses. But again, just remember back to the budget last October. I'm sure you've spoken to people in the pension and financial service industry. At least tens of thousands of people changed their pension arrangements because they were worried about what might happen in the budget. And I fear that will happen again, because it was fine. The Chancellor didn't do anything, but she also didn't say anything. So what is this government's policy on pension tax? I have not the foggiest notion. And yet, this is something where people need certainty over essentially the whole lifetime, but we don't get it over a couple of months, let alone over a lifetime.
And in particular, what you're thinking about whether or not they reduce the tax relief for pension contributions.
Yeah, so last autumn there was lots of speculation that they might cut the tax-free lump sum. And so certainly I haven't seen statistics on this, but talking to lots of people in the industry, they said lots of people just took out their tax-free lump sum in the run-up to the budget, which was not their original intention. So they kind of changed their behaviour because of that uncertainty. Now, that gets you a little bit of money, the tax-free lump sum. What gets you real money is if, for example, you were to say, for higher rate taxpayers, instead of getting relief at 40% or 45% of money you put in, you just get it at the basic rate, 20%. Now, in principle, that could get you, from memory, something like 15 billion a year. So that's real money, but very difficult to achieve. That would hit a very large number of teachers and nurses and so on who may not even think of themselves as higher rate taxpayers, but they're taken out of higher rate tax by the scale of their pension contributions.
Well, it's one of the reasons they didn't do it last time, because they realised that they would punish quite a lot of people who thought of themselves as Labour supporters.
Also incredibly complicated to do. And one thing where I will, there was even speculation after the last budget that they would only do this for people effectively in the private sector who put money into a so-called defined contribution scheme, and they wouldn't do it for people in their public sector. Now, if that happens, I will go absolutely ballistic, because that would be utterly outrageous in terms of different treatment of different groups. But anyway, that's one thing I'm sure they'll be thinking about, but I really hope they don't do it, because I think that'll be very damaging to the whole savings behaviour and the savings industry and so on. What else are their options? Again, if they're looking for serious money, I think you're right, Steph. Freezing allowances and thresholds for another couple of years gets you significant money. It drags more and more people into higher rates, but that doesn't seem to politically do any damage at all. A wealth tax is, the first thing is it will be incredibly difficult to put into place. So you could not announce a wealth tax on people more than £10 million in the autumn and bring it into effect next April.
Everyone would change everything, wouldn't they, to avoid it?
It would be very difficult.
Just because people would shift their assets. And
there's all sorts of... So let me put my cards on the table. I'd love to take money from people who've got more than 10 million quid. They've got piles, but this is really tough to do. So you need to value everything. So if you have a wealth tax that doesn't cover everything, then it just
from
becomes
homes to
homes, unincorporated businesses, farms, all of these things you need to include.
And that could take years to do in a.
And if you didn't, I think you said you're a business owner, Steph. I presume this is held by you. It's not quoted. Someone would have to come and value your business now. And there are.
But why not just do it on land?
Well, you could have a land tax. Now, council tax, obviously, and business rates for most properties and land sort of stand somewhere in place of that. So you could have a tax on farmland that would go down well.
I meant all land, including.
But farmland is the only serious bit of land that isn't taxed at the moment, because business rates and council tax, and they're not taxes on land as such. They're taxes on the property on the land. And I think in an ideal world, actually, for all sorts of economic reasons, there'd be a good case for replacing them with a land tax. But it's not going to get you piles of money, because you'd be replacing them. Now, a wealth
and also
tax,
people would pass it on just on land tax. If you're a business, you might not necessarily own the land, but you will lease a property, and then it's inevitable the landlord would just put up their rates, wouldn't they? So it would hit people.
That's not how it will work in the long run. There's a fixed supply of land, so that in the end, it's the owner of the land who bears the incidence of land taxes. Economists have always been in favour of a land tax. It's probably the least distortionary of all possible taxes, and it actually is in the end incident on the owners of the land, not on the people renting the land from them. Which is, I say, economists love land taxes, but they're very hard to achieve.
So why don't they do that then? Because that just feels, if you're saying it, then it wouldn't get passed on as a cost to others, then that feels like a really clever thing to do.
You would need to replace council tax and business rates with it, which would be you couldn't have a land tax and council tax and business rates on top. So, there are a group of people who would be big losers from this, of whom farmers would be the biggest, actually. It would have a particular effect in places like central London and so on. But
so if you're a landlord and you own, let's say, a massive shopping centre, so you own this shopping centre, you pay tax on that land the shopping centre's on, but it's the businesses inside who pay the business rates and pay council tax and things. It's not the landlord who pays.
No, this is a fundamental misunderstanding of
good.
Of
Explain
tax.
it to me, because
So this is about the incidence of the tax. So this, like employer national insurance contributions, or maybe VAT is the most obvious. It's the business who remit the tax to the HMRC when they sell something to me on which VAT is paid. But actually, the incidence of the VAT is on me. It's not on the business.
Yes.
Similarly, if I'm renting a property and I'm remitting the business rates, in the end, the incidence of those business rates is not on me, it's on the people I'm renting it from, because the market will set the appropriate rent, including business rates for these properties. So it would be more obvious if you had a tax which was directly paid by the landowner or the owner of the property. But in the long run, and the long run's important here, in the long run, the incidence is on the owner of the land or the owner of the property, not on the people renting it. Now, clearly, if you increase business rates this year, then for the next few years, the incidence is on you as the business. But in the long run, the incidence is on the owner. That's true in theory, but it's also true in practice. We've got analysis which shows that to be true.
But your fundamental point here is whatever somebody like me might say about how it's mad we don't have a land tax for the simple all the reasons you've mentioned. Nonetheless, we now have such a sort of complicated landscape of proxies for land taxes, whether it's business rates or council tax, and you couldn't combine the two in a rational way. So you'd have to do the kind of wholesale reform of the whole, in a sense, property taxation sort of labyrinth that we have at the moment, and that would take years.
But there's a strong case for doing that. I mean, where we are is a complete mess, and council tax is a complete disaster. And if you're really serious about a wealth tax, I mean, the first place you would start, surely, would be revaluing for council tax purposes and stopping it being a regressive tax. In other words, the more expensive your property at the moment, the less you pay in council tax as a fraction of the value of your property. You'd have, at the very least, a tax which is proportional to the value of the property and not capped. We are in this absurd situation where, a £50 million mansion in Westminster pays about the same council tax as a 3-bed summy in Hartlepool. I mean, it's absolutely outrageous. So all these people who say, let's have a wealth tax, well, let's at least start by reforming the taxes that we've got and actually charging people who live in £50 million properties more. I mean, places like Texas, for goodness sake, have more progressive property taxes than we do.
I want to set you the exam question that I would ideally like to put to Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer, because I think this is the sort of dilemma that they face, and the politics of it, particularly for a Labour government, are incredibly difficult. So there's quite a lot of evidence now that the non-dom reforms, that in fact Jeremy Hunt was the person who, in the most fundamental sense, introduced, and then Rachel Reeves built on them in her budget. It's a fair amount of evidence that quite a lot of wealthy people are now leaving the UK. And the thing they're most worried about actually is the bit that the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, was responsible for, which is that they're now going to be liable for inheritance tax on their worldwide assets if they live here for long enough. And most of them don't want to pay inheritance tax in the UK if they can move somewhere else. And so quite a lot of them are leaving. And, if you talk to both people inside and outside of government, there is a concern that this is going to cost the UK, because these are individuals who not only spend money here, but invest money here. And there's quite a lot of panic in the Treasury at the moment about the cost to the UK of these people leaving. And then on the other side of it, you've got Labour MPs saying the number one priority for this government should be to spend, I think it's £3.5 billion, to remove the 2-child limit on universal credit, because that is the best way to reduce child poverty. All right. So if you are a Chancellor or Prime Minister and you're thinking to yourself, crikey, I probably got to actually remove some of the more onerous tax that I've imposed on these very wealthy individuals if we're going to stand a chance of getting the growth rate up. And at the same time, we've got the OBR saying the public finances are in a bit of a mess. How, as a Chancellor, do you navigate this thing? Because all the pressures are on the spending side, and no Labour MPs likes the idea of actually giving what they would see as tax breaks to wealthy individuals. How on earth do they navigate this?
Well, that's a very good question, to which I don't have anything approaching a sensible answer. Look, I mean, on the non-DOMs thing, I mean, this is really difficult to analyse because we don't have the kind of data that really tells us what the effect of this has been. This is, I mean, some of it will be within government, some of it is lots and lots of anecdote. I mean, there's enough anecdote is enough to make you really quite worried about it. It's also worth saying that in the sort of fiscal forecast, there was already quite a big expected change in behaviour, and that still nevertheless got you more money in. It may be that the actual behaviour has been greater than was expected, but this is exactly the kind of trade-off that you need to make, and it's exactly the kind of trade-off you would have if you said, well, let's have this great, big wealth tax. Now, what effect would that have on where people live? But clearly non-DOMs are more mobile than most. So how do you balance those things?
As a Labour government.
Coming back to sort of an earlier theme, if you are a Labour government who really do want to spend more on welfare and public services and so on, you cannot, as a lot of their backbenchers seem to think, just say, well, someone else will pay for it. Either we'll borrow it, because as we've been talking, we're at the limit of what we can borrow, or some other group of rich people or wealthy people or foreign people or whatever will pay for it, because we're probably at the limit of what we can get there. We've been living in cloud cuckoo land for a long period of time, where we've basically been saying, look, you guys all average earnings and twice average earnings and so on. We're basically going to protect you, and someone else will pay for all of this. And that's basically where a lot of the debate is. Someone's going to have to come up at some point and say, if we're really going to pay for all of this, then you, the electorate, that's you on 40 or 50 or 70,000 pounds, you're going to have to pay for that, rather than pretending that it can all be paid for by these people with 10 million pounds or these non-DOMs or people on over 100,000 pounds or whatever it is.
I remember you saying when we were first talking to you before Labour came into power, and you were saying, if they say they didn't know about the black hole, I'll be raging. You said, you said various things like that about what they... But it feels like with something like non-DOMs, they could easily say, because there isn't the data or whatever to say how many people are leaving, and as you say, there's a lot of anecdote and a real lack of statistics here. It'd be quite easy for them to say, it feels like, in a few months or whenever you feel the impact of it. Oh, well, we just didn't, we weren't expecting that many people to go, and there's nothing to hold them to account, it feels like, when it comes to things like non-DOMs. Do you think there is?
Going back to the first part of that, yes, I mean, I do remember saying on this programme and elsewhere, if Rachel Reeves comes after the election and says, I've opened the books and discovered this black hole, I'll be really angry. And she did exactly that.
And you were
really angry. Because, I mean, there were some specifics there, but the broad picture of there being a problem and having to raise taxes was blindingly obvious in the run-up to the last election.
But this is obvious as well, isn't it? Behaviour will change if you tax wealthy people too much. Behaviour will change, whether you've got the stats or not. I just feel like we're going to be told when that does happen, oh, well, we didn't know, there was...
I mean, defining too much there is really difficult, to be fair. I mean, actually knowing at what point taxes, how much would you raise by increasing the top rate of tax from 45% to 50%? There's genuine uncertainty about that, for example. And I think there's genuine uncertainty about how non-DOMs would behave. So I think you've got some excuse, as it were, although, you're taking a risk. And I think the issue here is, what is your appetite for risk? And given that we are, I think, uncomfortably dependent on these very rich people for a very large fraction of our tax revenue, you might be quite risk averse. And I think we've not perhaps been as risk averse as we might have been.
Now, look, I think that's a good place to wrap. But, dear listener, worry not, because there's much more on these issues that, frankly, are relevant to all of us, whether we're just thinking about our own finances or thinking about, if we run a business, what the outlook is going to be for tax and growth. So much more from Paul Johnson, outgoing head of the IFS, one of the most influential people in the UK when it comes to understanding what we have to regard as the fiscal challenge. So that's it for this episode, but much more on Monday. Goodbye from me.
Yeah, we'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Goodbye from me.